Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar on unlocking S/4HANA success. Just before we begin, a couple of housekeeping. So we will send you the recording as you've registered for the webinar. It's likely to come around the 16th of May. Regarding submitting your questions, put them into the chat, and we will do a Q&A after the webinar, and then you will be sent a exit survey. Perfect. So here's with us today. Firstly, my name is Tess Hilton. I'm Associate Vice President of Sales with focus on the enterprise team at Qualitest. I also have with me today is Nick and Andrew, but I will let them do their own introductions. So Nick, firstly, if you could introduce yourself and give a little bit of an overview of Qualitest, and then we will hand it over to Andrew.
Have a very good to meet everyone. So I'm Nick Palasitis. I head up our UK enterprise practice. I'll come to that in a second. But in terms of who Qualitest are, we're the world's largest AI quality engineering service provider. We've been listed as market leaders across multiple disciplines within the quality engineering space. And as an organization, we're split up into a number of centers of excellence that provide deep domain expertise, whether that be automation, non-functional testing, digital engineering, AI services, and also enterprise services, which is the center of excellence that I sit in, and I head up our UK team. Our focus within the enterprise practice is very much on your market-leading COTS applications, so SAP, which we'll talk to at length today, but also Oracle, Salesforce, Microsoft Dynamics, Workday, etc. And within our practice, our focus is very much on end-to-end business process testing, and we have a number of purpose-built accelerators that we'll also touch on today that help accelerate the quality journey for some of our customers. And just some final points around partnerships. We've been a partner with SAP since 2007, so a very long-standing partnership. And likewise with Tricentis, we're a globally recognized solution partner and one partner of the year this year. And we work together on a number of engagements.
Nick.
Thanks, Nick. So me next. Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Andrew Power. I run the UK sales team at Tricentis. So I have a lot of experience working with our largest customers in the region, a lot of which are embarking on S/4HANA transformations, which is obviously what we're here to talk about today. A little bit about Tricentis. So Tricentis is a software vendor in the quality engineering space. As it shows on the slide here, we have over 3,000 global customers. We're very well recognized from an analyst perspective. So Gartner, IDC, and Forrester all have us in their leader quadrant or equivalent. We have a very broad technology support. So obviously, Nick, there you listed a lot of applications you work with. The technology at Tricentis supports all of those. But most importantly, for the purposes of this webinar, also SAP. Tricentis has a very unique relationship with SAP where we're what SAP defined as a solution extension partner. So for each discipline that supports SAP technology, they select one partner in that space that is their, I guess, chosen and recommended and supported official partner for that particular discipline. So for testing, that is Tricentis. So we're uniquely positioned, I guess, to talk a little bit about this topic and share how we've helped our other customers. The only other, I guess, things just to point out here is, or the main, I guess, thing that I want to highlight is just the fact that Tricentis has quite a broad portfolio. So we'll talk about what that means for those of you who are looking at SAP transformations, but we're able to cover pretty much everything that you'll need in relation to testing. So that's Tricentis.
Perfect. Thank you, Nick and Andrew. Right. So should we get started to the deep dive? So did you know that 45% of existing organizations have either already deployed or just started their S/4HANA transformation? Despite this overwhelming popularity, 60% of these organizations face quality issues and almost always run over budget, making these transformations the largest, most complex, and most expensive ever. So today's webinar, we will be looking at the key common challenges with S/4HANA application testing and how these testing challenges impact deployment and solution quality. Now I'll be handing it over to the experts to discuss. Andrew, talk me through what are the main challenges that you see customers facing pre-S/4HANA journey?
Right. Sure. So I think maybe, I guess before we dig into that, maybe if we start by taking a bit of a step back and just considering, I guess, why organizations are looking to transform, or why they're embarking on these transformations in the first place, right? So what is the business purpose? What are our customers trying to achieve? So for that, I guess a little bit of a history lesson. So I mean, SAP first released ECC in 2004, I think it was. So customers have been running different versions of ECC since then. Generally, from our experience of engaging with organizations, what we see is that they've matured a lot of the way that they deliver other technologies within their business. So, CRM, mobile, web, they've made a lot of advancements in that or in those spaces. But I think because of the complexity of an ERP system, that hasn't, or that, I guess that's almost been like the last piece of the jigsaw for customers. So they've got very mature delivery capability in all of these technologies that support ERP, but obviously ERP is the backbone. I think that's been something that hasn't really been touched. So and I guess that answers my question of why are organizations doing this. So it tends to be the final piece, I think, in that modernization. And it's also the most important piece. I referenced the fact that it's the backbone, but generally customers that are using SAP as their ERP system, it interfaces with everything. It controls all of their most important business processes. So embarking on this is not a small feat. It probably is going to be the largest, the most complex, the most expensive program from a technology perspective, but even potentially the entire business that these companies are going to be embarking on. So it's complex, it's super important, and it's a massive investment. So that's why I think a lot of these organizations are considering doing this. And I guess the business outcome is, from my experience, a lot of it is about agility. So again, it's that final piece that allows them to release innovation quicker to their customers. Organizations that have already done this tend to have a competitive advantage. They can move quicker, and organizations that haven't, they're looking to catch up. So I think that's what we're seeing and why customers are doing this. So then maybe to actually answer the question that you asked, so what are the challenges that we see? So I'm going to start with, I guess, pre-S4HANA and what we see when we're engaging with customers. So historically, the way that these organizations have run SAP can be quite siloed and separate. So what I mean by that is they'll quite often be a particular, I guess, department within IT, and all they do is focusing on delivering SAP. What that means is they tend to have different processes, different people, different tooling to other parts of the organization. And obviously the purpose of this webinar is to talk about testing. So maybe drilling in a little bit more there, we'll quite often see that organizations will have mature QA practices, QA functions, but they're quite often testing will either be completely siloed or will be tested in a different way. So what I think that means for the organizations we're engaging with is that the SAP teams tend to not be able to release change as quickly as some of the other organizations, which is fine when you're operating on S4. But if we then think about what we spoke about earlier, which is the need to be able to deliver innovation quickly, a lot of those processes, a lot of the way that SAP was being released and tested historically isn't going to be fit for purpose in the world of S4. So what I think we're seeing organizations do is they're using this huge transformation, the S4 transformation, as a bit of a catalyst to review change in other areas, and again, testing being one of them. So organizations spend a lot of time in the planning phase, and from our experience, I think the customers that are most successful, they include testing in that planning, and they understand early how it's going to impact, basically how it's going to impact the program. So and I think the final point that I wanted to make here is that, again, these organizations that have been working on ECC, they won't tend to have loads of experience in-house of S4 because obviously they've built up a team around ECC. So they're able to deliver ECC, they're familiar with ECC, but actually S4 and maybe specifically S4 testing, they might not have that experience and maybe they struggle to be self-sufficient. So that's then where, again, from a planning perspective, we see them engage with an organization that has that experience and that's able to help them build up that roadmap as to what's needed.
Yeah, so to summarize that point, Andrew, it's essentially the internal teams lacking the knowledge for S4HANA, where likelihood is they'll look for a third-party provider to support them in the transformation. Amazing. Okay, perfect. I'll hand over to Nick. So I guess moving kind of for pre-S4, and then kind of into that planning stage. Nick, what's a kind of a challenge that you kind of see firsthand?
Yeah, I'd
Right.
say and I totally agree with everything we've said so far. That's what we often see. SAP is a specialist skill set, and you can drill deeper into sort of the applications, whether that's ECC or S4HANA, each require their own specialist skill set, and then dig deeper into the business modules that exist within SAP, whether it's supply chain, EWM, sales and distribution, etc. So that's where the specialism comes in. And I think what we see often from a planning perspective, or the challenge with the planning perspective, is unpredictable timelines. And the reason we see that is we find quality is typically an afterthought during that planning design phase within an S4 transformation. We often see testing specialists are not involved in that phase. So what that means is testing is often underestimated, whether that be the timelines, the scope, the effort to achieve that timeline and scope. And when we consider, I think the stat you mentioned, that testing is 20% of the budget and timeline within an implementation, is critically important to get that planning phase right. Otherwise, the issues
Right.
we bake into that plan are then compounded as we start to move through these multi-year, multi-million-pound programs. So if testing is 20%, we're talking multi-million pounds with these transformations. The other thing we see by not engaging testing specialists within this phase is limited efficiencies built into those plans. So we often see the traditional manual bums on seats approach still exists much more within the SAP and ERP world than it does with other digital applications. And also with the traditional approach where everything is tested right at the end of the phase. And I think we talked about at the top of this how complex ERP transformations are. And the reason is it's a full-scale business transformation. It touches every single integration point, every single business process within the organization. So that approach is not fit for purpose with the volume and scale of change that's required for an S4 implementation. And we find organizations that adopt the traditional approaches within their planning often overrun programs, which compounds into multi-million pounds of overspent budget. The other piece is, so from a planning perspective, you've got your upfront planning where you baking your phases, your effort, your timelines, etc. A follow-on challenge we see from that is poor governance of that plan. So even if you have the best plan in the world, it needs to be followed and governed right the way through the life cycle of the engagement. And that's typically where we see often quality gates are missed and quality is pushed right towards the end of the program. And with these timelines squeezing and crunching, it's testing at the end of that, which is always put under pressure. And the techniques used, the manual techniques, are not able to respond, able to pivot in time to be able to course correct. Mm-hmm. So I mentioned already in terms of what the impacts are, that's program delays and ultimately corners getting cut when timelines are crunched and posing a significant risk to the business at go live. So solutions to this, we recommend testing specialists engaging early upfront so we can build in some of those efficiencies so you have the right plan first time, a plan for success. We embed all of those shift left efficiencies and accelerators, moving from more of a detect and fix approach to a preventative approach, whether that be aligning phases. So there's certain test phases we can run in parallel. There's certain that need to run more sequentially. We make sure that we've got confidence in the metrics, the effort metrics that we're using. So we've got tried and tested, refined metrics from multiple implementations of how long it takes to build a test case from an end-to-end perspective, how long it takes to execute, typical failure rates, how long it will take to retest a test. And And the reason we have those is so we build that plan from a bottom-up perspective, so businesses can be confident in the upfront estimations that they have. And equally, we focus on accelerators, but also just making sure that the phases have been structured in a reusable manner. And by that, I mean each phase feeds the next phase. So we're not looking to reinvent the wheel from one phase to another. It's everything complements one another and reduces the effort of all of the subsequent phases. And then finally, just a piece around governance. So once you've baked in that plan with the innovation, have a clear governance framework in place. So RACEs, RAID logs, clear quality gates, metrics that are tracking progress against plan right the way throughout that engagement. So if you do see that the program is starting to veer off course, you can course correct very quickly. And with those innovations and accelerators, they enable customers that adopt them to be able to pivot and to be able to adapt and react to these changes without it being hugely costly. And we have an example of that where organizations that do implement, say, a full suite of accelerators upfront in the planning process across a multi-year, multi-phase program can save up to 30% of their timelines on testing, which, some of these programs cost billions. So you can do the math. It's a huge sum of money.
Right. Thanks, Nick. I think it's multiple points you've raised. I think it's having the right testing governance, but also I think tooling needs to be a key consideration within the planning element to enable kind of different ways to accelerate the program. Okay, perfect. I will hand it back to Andrew for his next challenge.
Yeah, so I think it's. I was going to talk a little bit about picking up on that point around tooling, but I guess more broadly, just lack of innovation. So, I mean, Nick, you spoke about the process governance piece and also having the right people and the right experts in place early, which I obviously completely agree is really important. And I guess one of the outputs of all of that planning and having the right people in place generally is going to be some review of tooling or some review of the approach that you're taking, right? I mentioned, we spoke about Catalyst for Change. I think not taking this opportunity to review the existing approach, and that could be around anything. It could be testing, it could be data. If you don't review what you're doing at the moment and make sure it's going to be fit for purpose, both, I guess, during the transformation and also after, from my perspective, I think that's a really missed opportunity. So, again, I'm slightly generalizing, but Nick, I'll borrow you use the term bums on seats, but again, we do see that organizations have sometimes been testing manually. So, is there ways, or are there going to be ways to introduce automation into the program?
Right.
And maybe we'll start with, I guess, automation is one of the disciplines, because I think, and you guys can correct me if you disagree, that's probably, I think, the most common area where we see an ability to improve existing approaches, right? So, and again, I'll share a little bit more about Tricentis, but even taking Tricentis out, areas where we're testing manually, if we can automate that, that's going to provide huge efficiency gains. So I'm sure you guys will agree with that. So I think when looking at an automation tool, things that we would generally encourage people to consider. So number one is, of course, the ability to support SAP technology both now and in the future. So I mentioned at the beginning around our partnership with SAP. So one of the outcomes of that partnership is that we have development teams that work specifically with SAP development teams. So in future, when new releases, new changes, new patches, etc. release, Tricentis is, I think, uniquely positioned to be able to support that. So that's obviously going to be really important. Nick, I think you're going to talk a little bit later around making sure that we're covering testing not just within SAP. So I won't talk too much about that in this piece, but I guess just to highlight, I think that's really important, making sure that you're engaging with a tooling vendor that has that broad technology stack. So they're the items I wanted to call out in terms of things to consider with an automation tool. But I think also sometimes the question we get, and obviously you guys feel free to jump in on this one, is sometimes the question we get is like, why would we introduce automation now? So if we have been testing manually before, why wouldn't we just continue to test manually? Now, why would we look at automating now? And I have some thoughts, but also happy if you want to share.
Yeah, I'd say the simplest answer is return on investment. But the key decision makers, when you lay the numbers out in terms of the efficiencies from a resource perspective, so enabling them to move to more value add activities, the amount of acceleration they can achieve on the program, after the program, if they're doing multiple releases, and even into the BAU environment, it becomes a very simple business decision from a return on investment perspective. And I think that's the most powerful metric we see when we're speaking to senior leaders at some of these organizations on why would you not do it at this stage, especially when you're about to embark on such a catalyst of change. Innovation is the main reason a lot of organizations embark on this journey, even outside of testing. So it feels like a misstep if organizations don't use this opportunity to implement innovations that save them time and effort and money, like automation.
Yeah, and I think from the commercial side, when we're kind of pricing up the testing element, we see, yes, there's an upfront cost of automation, usually in, say, wave one, release one, but then the savings that they benefit from throughout the different releases or waves, it's a huge amount of savings. So that's where customers see putting up the upfront investment into automation and the likes of Tosca. They definitely see the benefits throughout that ongoing kind of program and into BAU.
Yeah, right. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was something I was going to comment on, right? I guess the ROI, it does compound as the program goes on. There is that piece of, I guess I'll use the term heavy lifting, but it pays off definitely in the later phases. And also, again, another thing that you're going to talk about, Nick, after the program, it also puts you in a position where we're going to set you up for success as well. So, so that, I guess that covers automation. One other point that I just wanted to talk about, and then again, you guys might have a view on this as well, is not just focusing on automation. So obviously within testing, there's lots of different disciplines, right? I think automation is probably that low hanging fruit, but there's also other areas like, for example, impact analysis, where we feel that organizations can gain significant, again, efficiencies from, I guess, quality, time, and cost as well. So just making sure that when you're reviewing your tooling, when you're engaging with organizations supporting you, you're also considering if there's other additional capabilities that you can add on top of the automation, just to help, I guess, help drive the program forward.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that comes back to the point I made earlier around efficiencies. I think that's probably one of the key areas we see organizations maybe fail to consider or fail to adopt, is the testing what matters and taking a risk-based targeted approach to handle this volume of change and to try and decipher what is important to the business. What are the must-haves, could-haves, should-haves, etc. Live Compare is a great example of a tool that enables you to cut through the the emotional side sometimes of where people sit within their own business functions and look at the data behind how the system is being used, and using that to inform what is critical to the business.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Just conscious on time, we might need to jump forward. So
Sure.
I guess when we speak to kind of clients, and Nick and I multiple times a week, we find when clients have onboarded a SI and they are potentially looking at carving out the testing piece of work, one element we do find is the lack of end-to-end business process coverage that the SI might be supporting, or the internal QA function of the client. So Nick, do you want to dive in a little bit deeper on that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we see this across, I would say, every organization that we speak to, when we have the opportunity to speak to them before they embark on their journey, as they're going through their tender process. The majority of organizations will need to deploy a system integrator to help them with this huge transformation. They are experts in S/4HANA, they're experts in deploying the solution, but often we find within this relationship, system integrators will be focusing on deploying and testing the code that they deliver within S/4HANA. we often see there's a gap left for businesses, and which typically falls on the business to test their end-to-end ecosystem. So that's the plethora of other applications that integrate into S4HANA, which I always forget the stats. I think it's like 60, 70 applications on average report or interface into S4HANA. The task of testing that from an end-to-end perspective falls on the business. And I think we talked about it in the beginning of this webinar. We've already said businesses often, one, maybe don't have the resources to scale, but two, are also not familiar with S4HANA as an application. So it puts an enormous burden, on the business users to test these end-to-end business processes, which traverse across S4HANA on an application that they're not familiar with. So that's typically where we see a huge gap within organizations. There's missed testing around, real world scenarios, real world variants. And we typically see 60% of defects discovered are during the end-to-end integration phase. So we're talking about an enormous amount of business risk that is almost left in the open, undecided as part of most of these programs. And that's typically where we consult with some of our customers, and we've got solutions to help them through that journey. But in examples where we're not engaged, often it's left for the business to test in UAT. And again, that further exacerbates the point from earlier where everything is left to the final stage. And it means business users are testing applications that they're maybe not familiar with, but also it means most of the time they're unearthing business critical defects, which erodes confidence in the solution and is not the purpose of your UAT phase. That should be more of a phase of acceptance for the business. So ultimately, we see if this gap isn't addressed effectively, it impacts quality, which can manifest itself in terms of lost revenue for customers, reputational damage, legal impacts. And there's multiple examples of the ripple effect of not testing code. I think CrowdStrike's probably a recent example, causing hundreds of millions of lost revenue across multiple sectors. And that came down to a lack of testing across variants. So in terms of solutions, when we're engaged, we always talk about embedding end-to-end testing upfront, so in the planning phase, to make sure it's built in, it's part of the scope. So system integration testing can often just refer to source middleware target testing and does not necessarily cover that full end-to-end piece. So we're talking order to cash, source to pay, record to report, your full value streams. And we would typically encourage you to utilize tools to help you with this as well. So the likes of Signavio, the likes of Live Compare, to help reduce the burden on that, and also deploy business process experts. So a lot of the time we're asked by organizations to provide order to cash experts, source to pay. They understand the S4HANA solution, but they also understand the core backbone of an order to cash process. So that enables them to take a slightly tool agnostic view to some of those upstream and downstream applications because they understand the underlying business process. And then of course within that, making sure that end-to-end business process is being automated early. So start to build up those automation modular components that can then be strung together and help accelerate testing across the life cycle of your program. And just one example to call out where it's not considered in the planning phase. We know a lot of our organizations run Workday, for example, and we see often that organizations that are implementing S4HANA have to change their cost center structure, for example. This often has implications on other applications that are utilizing that, which often impacts Workday. And we see that's a very specific issue, but we see it come up often for multiple clients that are running S4HANA and Workday. And that's just one example of, if you don't take an end-to-end view, an end-to-end lens when you're planning this upfront, those are the type of scenarios that you miss upfront and you find them later in the day, and then you're talking about significant program delays.
Perfect. And I think finally, kind of to wrap up kind of the challenges is, once the client's completed the S4 journey, post-program, kind of where do you see clients facing the most amount of pain?
Yeah, we always call this pain after program. we see it often, and it's a very understandable approach that organizations take, because these programs are so huge, so transformational, taking the majority of resources from within a business to focus on. But we often see organizations take a very blinkered approach to the program. And what that does is leaves a void post-program. So we find a lot of organizations will not necessarily have a plan in place of how they're going to manage and accelerate change beyond the life cycle of the program. And this is where some of the traditional approaches we mentioned earlier in the program don't just sting you on the program, but sting you beyond that. So the impact of taking a very heavy manual testing approach means you have limited reusability, a limited framework to be able to accelerate change beyond the scope of the program. And particularly in the SaaS world, where we have a number of SaaS applications integrated into SAP, those all come with their own vendor pushed releases. So the scale and the speed that change needs to happen, or testing of change needs to happen, is only increasing. And we find with those manual assets, organizations are left unable to cope with the volume of change post-program. So that either means they have to deploy large teams to continually manually test, which costs them a lot of money, or they start to lose competitive edge within the market. And also we see with that manual approach, it's not just building the assets as part of the program, but it's being able to maintain those as well. And we see often there's a gap between the program team and life after the program, where assets are handed over to a business who don't necessarily fully understand those assets, and then they start to fall out of sync with the solution. And we talked about return on investment earlier in this. Those assets in automation, for example, continues to deliver return on investment if it maintains synchronization with the system. If it starts to fall out of sync with the system, you have a pack that is not necessarily reflective, and it's not going to be fit for purpose and being able to give you that acceleration across the board. So solution wise, again, it all comes up to the strategy and planning. So making sure when we're planning these phases out, they're built with the end in mind. So we're enforcing repeatable frameworks. We're making sure all of these innovations are baked into your plan. So we talked about some of them earlier, but also we have a number of accelerators for, say, the requirement phase. We've got a requirement validator that also acts as a quality health check to make sure your requirements are being built accurately and they're not ambiguous. So that, again, shifts quality left to make sure the solution quality is strong up front. We've got out-of-the-box libraries that we hand over to our customers, built on market-leading tools. And from an automation perspective, we've got an out-of-the-box S/4HANA automation library. So all of that helps accelerate the customer journey within the program, but also leaves them with all of these assets that they get to keep after the program to help them accelerate change.
Okay, well, I think we're nearly at time. So thank you, Nick and Andrew, for an insightful, engaging session. I just wanted to quickly recap some of the key themes that we covered today. So we had the pre-S/4HANA transformation. We often face challenges rooted in organizational structures and the cultural complexities of the program. We've got during the transformation, it's critical to establish robust testing, planning, and governance frameworks to ensure success. We find lack of innovation accelerators being leveraged, which can hinder both the speed and value, and insufficient end-to-end business process coverage, which compromises transformation efficiencies. And then finally, many organizations experience the post-program pain that Nick was just mentioning, highlighting the importance of long-term strategy and support planning. Okay, so now that's the end of the webinar. As again, thank you both for joining, and everyone else that has been on the call today. We hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you.
Great. Cheers, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.